Lena Harris had moved to the small lakeside community in rural Oregon with a very deliberate purpose, one that had been taking shape for many years before she even found the property that would eventually become her home. For over 2 decades, she had worked as an architect in Portland, designing other people's dream houses, renovations, and commercial spaces, always pouring her attention into the details that would make someone else's life feel settled and whole, but never really stopping long enough to consider what that meant for her. She had loved the work for a time, but after her divorce and the exhausting run of large corporate projects, she realized she was craving a quieter, more meaningful life that belonged entirely to her. The lake property appeared at the right moment, a long-neglected parcel with an overgrown yard and a century-old farmhouse that had been sitting empty for at least 5 years. When she first walked the land, crunching through dry leaves on the winding driveway that led up to the peeling 2-story house, she felt an almost immediate pull. There was nothing glamorous about the place. Its porch sagged slightly. The paint on the siding was a tired shade of gray that had nearly faded to silver, and the barn behind the house had partially collapsed, leaving its beams leaning dangerously inward. Yet Lena saw something beautiful in the property's bones. The trees surrounding the house were enormous and old, with trunks thick as columns and canopies that filtered the sun into golden patches. The lake shimmered in the distance, visible through a clearing in the woods, and despite the decay of the structures, the land felt alive in a way she could not explain. She made the purchase quickly, sinking most of her savings into the deal, and then threw herself into the work of restoring both the house and the grounds. For the first year she lived there, her days began at sunrise and ended well after dark. She repaired the house room by room, beginning with the kitchen, which had broken cabinets and rusted plumbing, then moving through the bedrooms, the roof, and eventually tackling the rotted deck. She salvaged wood from the barn and incorporated it into her designs where she could, determined to keep the original character of the property intact. As an architect, she had the skill to make structural changes properly, and she hired local electricians, plumbers, and masons to handle what was beyond her expertise. It was grueling, expensive work, but every small improvement gave her a deeper sense of ownership and connection to the land. In the evenings, when her hands ached from sanding floors or hauling debris, she would walk to the edge of the lake and stand quietly, listening to the wind rushing through the trees. Those moments of stillness reminded her why she had come. Her closest neighbor was Garrett Bailey, a man she had only seen in passing during the year she had lived there. His property was about 300 yards away on the other side of a cluster of maples and evergreens, and from what Lena could tell, he lived alone. He was perhaps a decade older than she was, late 50s or early 60s, and had the wiry frame of someone who spent more time outdoors than inside. There was something closed off about him that made Lena cautious. The few times they had crossed paths, his conversation had been clipped and almost perfunctory. A curt nod at the mailbox, a muttered greeting when she passed him on the narrow road leading into town. He never made eye contact for long, and his property always seemed strangely fortified, with tall fences, locked gates, and a collection of warning signs posted along the perimeter. Occasionally, Lena would hear bursts of activity from his place late at night, the sound of engines revving, voices shouting over music, and sometimes the sharp crack of something that could have been fireworks. She told herself it was none of her business. He had not caused her any direct trouble, and after years of city life, she appreciated having a neighbor who seemed disinterested in small talk or superficial friendliness. But there was an edge to Garrett that unsettled her, and she learned to keep a wide berth. That spring, after the worst of the house renovations had been completed, Lena began focusing on the land. She had already cleared much of the underbrush and had planted several young fruit trees along the property line closest to the road. She had plans to restore the barn as a studio space for her design work, but for now it was still unsafe to enter. Instead, she spent hours repairing fences, building raised garden beds, and reseeding large patches of bare soil. By late April, the property was finally starting to look less like an abandoned homestead and more like the sanctuary she had envisioned. She felt proud of how far it had come and was just beginning to allow herself the luxury of slower mornings and evenings spent reading on the porch, no longer compelled to fix everything at once. One particularly warm evening in early May, Lena was sitting at her drafting table in the front room when she caught the unmistakable scent of smoke drifting through the open window. At first, she assumed someone in the area was using a wood stove or fire pit. Rural life came with the constant presence of controlled burns, especially as neighbors cleared brush in preparation for fire season. But this smell was stronger than usual, acrid and dense, the kind that clung to the back of your throat. Lena stepped outside onto the porch and immediately saw a flicker of orange through the trees on the far side of her yard. Her stomach tightened. The glow was too large and too close to be a campfire. She grabbed a flashlight and hurried across the uneven ground, weaving between the garden beds and the newly planted trees, her mind racing through the possibilities. Had a branch fallen onto the power lines? Had a brush fire started near the old barn? She did not smell electricity or hear the buzz of downed wires, but the smoke was thickening, and the orange light was growing brighter with each step. As she pushed through the last row of trees and reached the edge of the clearing that marked the boundary of her property, Lena froze. There, on a patch of open ground just beyond her fence line, Garrett Bailey stood over a massive bonfire. The flames roared upward, fueled by what looked like a pile of wooden pallets, scrap lumber, and black plastic trash bags that hissed as they melted in the heat. Sparks lifted into the air and drifted toward the trees, which were still dry from the long winter. Lena's first thought was how dangerously close the fire was to the old barn on her side of the line. One good gust of wind, and the entire structure could go up in seconds. She stepped closer and shouted his name over the noise of the fire. Garrett turned slowly, his face illuminated by the flames, and for a moment she could not read his expression. Then his mouth twisted into something that looked like irritation more than surprise. "You're on my land," Lena called out, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Put that out now before it spreads." Garrett barked a short laugh and gestured broadly at the fire with the metal poker he held. "This is my burn pit," he said, his voice flat and dismissive. "I've been using this spot for years. You just moved in. You don't get to tell me what I can do on my own property." "That's not your property," Lena shot back, pointing at the ground where the boundary markers were still visible from the recent survey she had ordered during her renovations. "This is the line. You're over it. You're on my side, and you're going to start a wildfire if you don't stop." Garrett's eyes narrowed and he took a step toward her, the poker still in his hand. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and edged with hostility. "I've lived here longer than you've been in this state. Don't make the mistake of thinking you can push me around because you paid for some fancy survey." The heat from the fire was so intense now that Lena could feel it against her face, and the wind was picking up, blowing embers toward her yard. She hesitated, torn between retreating and holding her ground, but then another gust sent a shower of sparks arcing over the fence toward the barn. She took a step back and pulled her phone from her pocket, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. Garrett saw what she was doing and raised the poker slightly, as if to intimidate her into hanging up. Lena met his glare, forcing her voice to stay steady as she spoke to the dispatcher. "This is an uncontrolled burn," she said. "The fire is spreading, and it's on my property. I need the fire department out here now." As she gave the address, Garrett cursed under his breath and turned back to the fire, stabbing at the pile with the poker as if he could somehow regain control of the flames. But it was clear he had lost it. The fire was too large, the materials too volatile, and the wind too strong. Lena backed away slowly, unwilling to turn her back on him, and then retreated through the trees toward her house, the glow of the fire following her like a beacon. She could hear Garrett shouting something behind her, but she could not make out the words over the roar of the flames. All she could think was that if the fire reached the barn, it could easily jump to the house, and then everything she had worked for over the past year would be gone in a matter of minutes. She reached her porch just as she heard the distant wail of sirens cutting through the quiet evening air. Relief surged through her, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a conflict that would not be easily resolved. Garrett Bailey had made it very clear that he considered her an enemy now, and Lena could already sense the weight of what that would mean in the days to come. The fire engines arrived faster than Lena had dared hope, their flashing lights cutting through the dusk as the first truck pulled into the narrow gravel road that led to her house. She waved frantically from her porch, directing the firefighters toward the clearing where Garrett's bonfire continued to rage. 2 fire marshals jumped out immediately, uncoiling hoses as they sprinted toward the flames, while another stayed behind to question Lena about what had happened. She explained in as much detail as she could, her voice steady but sharp with anger, describing how Garrett had built the fire directly on her side of the property line and ignored her pleas to put it out. She pointed out the fresh boundary markers from the survey, the ones Garrett had claimed were meaningless, and the marshal scribbled notes on a clipboard, nodding grimly. When Lena mentioned that Garrett had approached her with a metal poker in his hand, the marshal's expression tightened even further. "Stay here," he instructed, gesturing for her to remain near the truck as they confronted Garrett. From her vantage point at the edge of the clearing, Lena watched the firefighters working quickly to contain the fire. They sprayed foam and water directly into the base of the flames, dousing the piles of burning lumber and trash until the fire shrank to a smoldering heap. Garrett stood off to the side, arms crossed and jaw clenched, muttering under his breath as one of the marshals questioned him. He kept gesturing toward the ground, clearly insisting that the burn pit was on his land, and at one point he jabbed a finger in Lena's direction as though blaming her for the entire situation. The marshals did not seem convinced. They walked the perimeter of the fire pit, examined the charred remains of the boundary markers, and took photographs of everything before finally telling Garrett to step away. Lena could not hear every word, but she caught enough phrases to piece together the exchange. Violation, uncontrolled burn, failure to comply, and property damage. Garrett's voice rose in protest, but the marshals were firm, explaining that he would need to appear at the county office within the week to provide proof of compliance with state fire regulations. They handed him a citation on the spot, and though Lena half expected him to tear it up, he stuffed it into his pocket and stalked away toward his house without another word. The glare he threw her as he passed enough to make her stomach knot. Once the fire was fully extinguished and the danger had passed, the lead marshal walked Lena back to her porch to take her statement in greater detail. He asked if she had any evidence of Garrett's actions before they arrived, and she told him she had managed to record a brief video on her phone while the fire was at its peak. She handed the device over so he could review the footage, and he nodded approvingly when the screen clearly showed Garrett standing over the flames, the fire already spilling over the edge of the pit. "This will help," he said quietly, returning the phone to her. He explained that Garrett would likely be fined heavily for violating multiple burn ordinances, and, depending on the county's findings during a follow-up inspection, there could be additional consequences. Lena felt a rush of vindication, but it was quickly overshadowed by an uneasy sense of what Garrett's anger might look like when there were no officials standing between them. She thanked the marshal for his help, asked about next steps, and was told that the county fire inspector would reach out to schedule a formal interview and possibly an on-site review of the property line. "In the meantime," he added, his voice softening slightly, "keep your phone close and call us if he shows up here again. Don't engage him directly. We'll handle it." The trucks finally pulled away just after dark, leaving Lena alone on the quiet porch, the faint smell of burned plastic and wood still hanging in the air. She locked the doors and windows, turned on every light in the house, and sat at her kitchen table replaying the events over and over in her mind. Garrett had looked at her like a man who believed he had been publicly humiliated, and she could not shake the feeling that he would not let it go. She tried to sleep that night but kept waking at the slightest noise, convinced she would see the glare of his flashlight cutting through her yard or hear the crunch of boots on the gravel driveway. The fear was exhausting, but it also sharpened her instincts. By morning, she had made a list of practical steps she needed to take. Call the surveyor to confirm the boundary line again. Check her existing security cameras to ensure they covered the area near the burn pit, and notify the county sheriff's office about the confrontation in case Garrett tried to retaliate. She was not going to allow herself to be bullied into silence. The first call she made was to the surveyor who had completed the property assessment when she purchased the house. He was sympathetic and offered to send her copies of the full report, including the exact coordinates of the boundary markers, which she could present to the county inspector if there was any dispute. He also reminded her to document everything in writing, a suggestion Lena took seriously. She photographed the burn site in daylight, capturing the scorched ground and the broken marker posts, then backed up the video from her phone onto her computer. By the time she finished, she felt at least marginally better, as though gathering evidence could protect her from Garrett's simmering resentment. But that sense of control did not last long. Just before noon, Lena stepped outside to tend to the garden beds and noticed something odd nailed to her fence. At first, she thought it was just another piece of debris from the fire, but as she got closer, she saw that it was a warped plank of wood with large black letters scrawled across it in spray paint. Mind your own business. Her heart skipped a beat. She scanned the property line, half expecting to see Garrett watching from the tree line, but the woods were silent. She took a photo of the message, removed the board carefully using gloves, and immediately called the sheriff's office to report the intimidation. The deputy who answered her call was polite but cautious, explaining that unless they could prove Garrett had placed the sign himself, there was little they could do beyond making a note in their records. Lena pressed the issue, pointing out the timing and the obvious connection to the fire, but the deputy simply advised her to remain vigilant and call again if the situation escalated. It was not the reassurance she wanted, but it reinforced her decision to take every precaution she could on her own. That afternoon, she visited the local hardware store and purchased 2 additional security cameras, which she installed herself on the corners of the house that faced Garrett's property. She adjusted the settings to send alerts directly to her phone whenever motion was detected, hoping it would give her some peace of mind. Yet, even as she tightened the final screws, Lena could not ignore the growing unease that Garrett might do something far worse than leave a threatening message. She thought about his words by the fire pit, the way he had insisted he had lived there longer than anyone, and how he had dismissed the survey markers as meaningless. There was a deep sense of entitlement in his voice, a belief that his history on the land somehow gave him the right to ignore the law. Lena suspected that the county citation would only feed that resentment, and she began to wonder just how far he might go to defend his imagined claim. The call from the fire inspector came the next day. The man was thorough and professional, explaining that they would need to conduct a full site inspection to verify whether Garrett's burn pit was on Lena's property and to determine if any environmental hazards had been created by the fire. He scheduled the visit for later that week, warning her that Garrett would likely be notified as well since he was the subject of the complaint. Lena braced herself for another confrontation, knowing he would view her cooperation with the authorities as yet another act of betrayal. She did not relish the idea of seeing him again, but she refused to back down. This was her home, and she had every right to protect it. The days leading up to the inspection were tense. Lena kept her routines as normal as possible, but she noticed subtle signs that Garrett was watching her. One morning, she found her trash can tipped over and its contents strewn across the driveway, though there was no evidence of animals. Another evening, as she returned from town, she caught a glimpse of a figure retreating into the woods near her fence line, but by the time she reached the spot, there was no one there. She documented each incident and forwarded the information to the sheriff's office, but again they could only add it to the growing list of reports. At night, she lay awake listening for footsteps outside, her phone clutched in her hand, wondering if Garrett was out there somewhere in the darkness, planning his next move. By the time the fire inspector arrived with 2 deputies in tow, Lena felt a mixture of relief and dread. She guided them to the burn site, showed them the videos and photographs, and answered every question carefully. The inspector took soil samples and examined the charred remnants of the fire pit, making meticulous notes about its proximity to the survey markers. He did not share his conclusions immediately, but he did confirm that Garrett had failed to appear at the county office as instructed and that further action would likely be taken. Lena knew this was the right outcome, but as the officials left, she could not shake the feeling that Garrett would not accept it quietly. She stood at the edge of her property for a long time after their cars disappeared down the road, staring into the shadowy woods that separated her home from his, and felt the same cold certainty she had felt the night of the fire. This was not over, and the worst might still be ahead. The days following the county inspection were marked by a tense stillness that felt heavier than any direct confrontation could have been. Lena tried to tell herself that Garrett might simply accept whatever consequences the authorities handed down and retreat back into the reclusive solitude that had characterized his life before the fire, but her instincts told her otherwise. There was an unspoken hostility hanging in the air, a sense of watchfulness that made even the simplest tasks feel fraught with risk. When she walked to the edge of the lake in the evenings, she sometimes imagined she could feel eyes on her from somewhere in the tree line. The security cameras she had installed would occasionally ping her phone with motion alerts late at night, but when she checked the live feed, there was never anything definitive, just the swaying of branches or the flicker of a distant light. Each false alarm left her more exhausted, but she refused to disable the system. If Garrett was trying to unsettle her, she was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. A week after the inspection, Lena woke to find a heavy object hanging from her fence. At first, in the pale light of dawn, she thought it was just another warped plank like the one that had carried the spray-painted threat, but as she approached, she realized it was far more disturbing. Someone had tied together a bundle of dead animal remains, what looked like the decomposed carcasses of raccoons or possums, and suspended it from the fence post closest to her garden. The smell was rancid and the image grotesque, the kind of deliberate cruelty meant to inspire fear. Elena stood frozen for a long moment, her stomach twisting, before forcing herself to retrieve gloves and a heavy-duty trash bag. She photographed the scene from multiple angles, then carefully cut the bundle down and sealed it away, all the while aware of how vulnerable she felt out in the open. She immediately called the sheriff's office to report the incident, but as before, the deputy who took her statement could offer little beyond a promise to add it to the growing file. "We don't have proof of who did it," he reminded her, the same weary refrain she had heard after every complaint. "But we'll keep this on record." Lena hung up the phone and sat at her kitchen table, trying to steady herself. The logical part of her brain told her that the best thing she could do was to stay calm, document everything, and allow the authorities to build their case. But another part, the one that felt the full weight of Garrett's escalating intimidation, wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. She had done nothing wrong. She had not provoked him beyond simply insisting on her right to live safely on her own land, and yet she was the one who now felt like a prisoner in her own home. She looked at the list she had started keeping of each incident, the overturned trash can, the spray-painted sign, the sightings near the fence line, and now the carcass, and knew that the pattern was unmistakable. Garrett was testing her boundaries, seeing how far he could push before she broke or retreated. That afternoon, she decided to take additional precautions. She drove into town and met with a local contractor who specialized in fencing and property security, explaining that she needed a more substantial barrier between her land and Garrett's. The contractor, a burly man named Tom Callahan, listened carefully and did not dismiss her concerns. He walked the property line with her and noted where the existing fence was weakest, then provided a quote for installing a taller, reinforced barrier with steel posts sunk deep enough to prevent tampering. The price was steep, but Lena agreed without hesitation. "I can't afford not to," she told Tom, who nodded grimly. He promised to begin the work within the week. While waiting for the fence installation to begin, Lena redoubled her efforts to remain vigilant. She kept the security cameras angled toward the property line and set her phone to notify her instantly of any movement. One night, just past midnight, an alert jolted her awake. She scrambled to check the live feed and saw a shadowy figure lingering near the edge of the woods where the burn pit had been. The figure crouched for a moment, doing something she could not quite make out, and then disappeared into the trees. Lena called 911 immediately, and a deputy was dispatched, but by the time he arrived, there was no trace of the intruder. The deputy searched the area with a flashlight and found only a few fresh boot prints in the soft soil near the fence. Lena was frustrated but not surprised. This was how Garrett operated, slipping in and out just long enough to remind her that he could. The next morning, she discovered what the figure had been doing. Several bright orange boundary markers that had been placed by the surveyor were missing, and in their place, someone had hammered crude wooden stakes into the ground at a slightly different angle, effectively shifting the perceived property line by several feet. Lena immediately contacted the surveyor's office to report the tampering, and they agreed to send a crew out to replace the markers and document the interference. This kind of thing isn't uncommon in boundary disputes, the clerk explained on the phone, but the law is very clear. Moving or removing official markers is a serious offense. Lena thanked her and hung up, her hands trembling as she set the phone down. She knew Garrett was trying to build a false narrative that the land was his, and she feared what he might do next to support that illusion. The arrival of the surveyors seemed to agitate him further. As they worked to reset the markers and photograph the altered stakes, Garrett appeared at the edge of his driveway, glaring openly at Lena and the crew. He did not approach or speak, but the message was clear. He was watching, and he resented every moment of their presence. Lena forced herself to remain composed, answering the surveyor's questions calmly and thanking them for their thoroughness, even as her heart pounded in her chest. She could feel Garrett's stare like a weight pressing down on her, and she was grateful when the crew finally finished and left. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, Lena heard the sound of a vehicle idling somewhere near the back of her property. She stepped onto her porch and listened, trying to pinpoint the direction, but the noise cut off abruptly, leaving only the rustle of leaves in the wind. She decided not to investigate alone. Instead, she called Tom, the contractor, and asked if he could expedite the fence installation. "I'll get my crew out there tomorrow," he promised, his voice serious. "This doesn't sound like something you want to wait on." True to his word, Tom arrived the next morning with a small team, and they began tearing out sections of the old fence and setting the new posts. Lena stayed close by as they worked, both to answer questions and to provide a visible presence on the property. Several times she caught sight of Garrett lingering in the distance, standing with his arms crossed as he watched the construction. He said nothing, but the set of his jaw and the tightness of his shoulders betrayed his anger. Lena refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on the steady progress of the crew. By the end of the day, half the perimeter was reinforced with a solid 6-foot barrier, and Lena felt a flicker of relief. That relief was short-lived. 2 nights later, just after midnight, the sound of splintering wood jolted her awake. She grabbed her phone and raced to the back door, where the security light had been triggered. Through the glass, she could see a section of the newly installed fence leaning at an unnatural angle, its posts cracked at the base. Whoever had done it was already gone, but the damage was unmistakable. Lena called 911 again, and a deputy was dispatched. But as usual, there was little he could do beyond taking photographs and filing another report. "He's escalating," the deputy said quietly as they surveyed the wreckage. "Be careful, Miss Harris. People like this, they don't always think rationally." Lena nodded, her throat tight. She knew the deputy was right. Garrett's actions were becoming bolder, and each incident carried the unspoken threat that the next one might cross a line from intimidation into outright violence. She was doing everything she could to protect herself, installing security measures, cooperating with the authorities, reinforcing her property, but she could not shake the feeling that she was one step behind, reacting to his moves rather than preventing them. As she stood in the cold night air, staring at the shattered fence, Lena made herself a quiet promise. She would not let Garrett drive her from the home she had fought so hard to rebuild. She would see this through, no matter how unnerving the path ahead might be. The county inspector returned 2 weeks later with a team, this time joined by 2 deputies and an environmental specialist, and the sight of so many official vehicles pulling into the narrow drive brought Lena a mixture of hope and unease. She hoped their presence would mean an end to Garrett's unchecked hostility, but she also knew that their findings might provoke a reaction she was not fully prepared for. The inspector wasted no time. He walked her property with the environmental specialist, measuring distances from the fire pit to the survey markers, reviewing the photographs Lena had taken of the tampered boundary stakes, and taking additional soil samples near the burn site. Lena trailed behind, answering questions about what she had observed since the last visit, describing the night she saw a figure in the woods and the repeated incidents of vandalism. She was careful to stick to facts, though the urge to let her frustration spill out was almost overwhelming. She wanted them to understand how relentless Garrett's campaign had become, how each minor act of intimidation was a part of a larger pattern designed to wear her down. The environmental specialist was particularly concerned about the soil near the burn pit, noting that the debris Garrett had been burning included melted plastic, paint cans, and what appeared to be treated lumber. He explained that such materials could leach toxic chemicals into the ground and potentially contaminate groundwater, especially with the property's proximity to the lake. "If this tests positive," he told Lena quietly, "we'll have to treat this as an environmental hazard, and that will complicate things for your neighbor considerably." She nodded, feeling a small but powerful surge of vindication, though she kept her expression neutral. She had no desire to gloat, only to see the situation resolved in a way that would ensure her safety. Once the inspection of her land was complete, the team requested access to Garrett's property. Lena stood back as the deputies approached his gate and knocked loudly, announcing their presence. For a long moment, there was no response, and Lena wondered if he might try to ignore them altogether. Then, slowly, the gate opened, and Garrett appeared. His face was a mask of hostility as he stepped outside, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The inspector explained the purpose of their visit and handed him a copy of the citation from the previous fire violation, which Garrett crumpled in his fist without reading. "You people don't have the right to be here," he said flatly, though his voice carried an edge of something less certain, a flicker of fear beneath the defiance. One of the deputies reminded him that they did, in fact, have the legal authority to conduct the inspection, and after a tense pause, Garrett stepped aside. Lena could not see every detail from where she stood, but she watched as the team fanned out across Garrett's yard, pointing out structures and taking photographs. She knew from previous glimpses over the fence that his property was cluttered with haphazard outbuildings, rusting vehicles, and piles of scrap metal. But seeing the officials cataloging it all made her stomach knot. She had a sense that they were uncovering problems far beyond the burn pit. After nearly an hour, the inspector returned to speak with her privately. "We found serious code violations," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Several of his outbuildings are structurally unsound, and we located an old underground storage area that's flooded and unstable. We'll be filing a report recommending the property be condemned until it's brought up to code. That process will take time, and he'll have the right to appeal. But—" He trailed off, clearly choosing his words carefully. "This is not a safe place for anyone to be living." Lena felt a mixture of relief and dread wash over her. Relief because this was the first tangible step toward ending the cycle of intimidation, and dread because she knew Garrett would blame her for whatever happened next. As the team wrapped up their work and left, she stayed near her porch, watching his house from a distance. She saw him pacing near his driveway, shoulders tight, occasionally glancing toward her property. She had the distinct sense he was planning something, though what that might be, she could not guess. That night she kept the lights on and the security system armed, sleeping lightly and waking at every creak of the old farmhouse. Around 3 in the morning, the motion alert on her phone vibrated sharply, jolting her fully awake. She reached for the phone and pulled up the camera feed, her heart pounding as she saw the grainy image of Garrett standing just beyond her fence line, staring directly into the lens. He didn't move for several long seconds, simply watching, before turning and walking back into the shadows. Lena sat rigid in bed, clutching the phone, debating whether to call the sheriff's office immediately or wait until morning. She knew the deputies could do little without a clear threat, and yet the act of him standing there felt more menacing than any overt gesture could have. It was a message. He was not finished, no matter what the county decided. The following morning, Lena filed another report, forwarding the camera footage as evidence. She received a polite but unsurprising response from the sheriff's office. The footage had been logged, but unless Garrett trespassed or damaged property, they could not intervene. She was left with the gnawing realization that the legal process would not shield her from the day-to-day reality of living next to someone determined to unsettle her. She spent the day installing additional motion lights around the perimeter of her yard and reinforcing the doors and windows of the house, anything to make it more difficult for Garrett to approach unnoticed. Yet, even as she worked, she felt the weight of the coming confrontation pressing in, inevitable and inescapable. She understood now that this was not just a dispute about property lines or burn pits. It was about control, about a man who believed he could bend reality to his will, and about her refusal to allow it. The county's decision to begin condemnation proceedings against Garrett's property set in motion a chain of events Lena had been bracing herself for, but still felt wholly unprepared to endure. The official notice arrived by certified mail at the end of the week, and though she was not privy to the exact contents, she could guess from Garrett's reaction when he found the envelope in his mailbox. She had been out in her garden bed pulling weeds when she heard the sharp metallic slam of the box's lid, followed by a guttural curse that carried clearly through the trees. She froze, crouched low as Garrett tore the envelope open and scanned the letter, his face contorting with rage. He crumpled the paper violently in his fist, then hurled it to the ground and stomped it with his boot before spinning on his heel and retreating up the gravel drive toward his house. Lena exhaled slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears, and tried to focus on the simple rhythm of her work, but her hands trembled so badly she nearly uprooted the seedlings she had been tending. The next few days passed under a tense and brittle silence. Garrett did not approach her directly, but she could feel his anger radiating across the property line, a pressure that seemed to build with each passing hour. She noticed that the lights in his house burned late into the night, and that the sounds of hammering and dragging could be heard from his yard at odd intervals, as though he were dismantling or hiding things before the county's next inspection. Lena forced herself not to speculate, though she documented each unusual noise or sighting in the journal she had begun keeping. She knew from experience that every detail could matter later, that establishing a pattern of behavior might be the only protection she had if the situation escalated further. It was on the 4th night after the notice arrived that the escalation came. Lena had just settled into bed, the security system armed and her phone charging on the nightstand, when a deafening crash from the back of the property jolted her upright. She grabbed the phone instinctively, heart racing as she pulled up the camera feed. The image that filled the screen made her stomach drop. A section of the reinforced fence Tom's crew had installed was collapsed inward, its heavy steel posts bent and splintered as though struck by a vehicle. Beyond the wreckage, a dark figure moved quickly through the gap, vanishing into the shadows near the barn. Lena dialed 911 with shaking hands, whispering her address to the dispatcher and begging them to send units immediately. She stayed low as she crept down the hallway toward the back of the house, every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden until help arrived. She could hear footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, deliberate and slow, moving toward the porch. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then stopped, and the footsteps retreated. A moment later, a loud metallic clang rang out from the direction of the barn, followed by the unmistakable splintering sound of wood being pried apart. Lena clamped a hand over her mouth, terrified the sound of her own breathing might carry, and crouched in the corner of the living room, eyes locked on the back door. The flashing lights of the deputies' cruisers arrived just in time to prevent her from breaking down entirely. She could hear the vehicles skidding to a stop at the end of the drive, doors slamming, voices shouting commands into the night. The noises from the barn ceased abruptly, replaced by the thud of running footsteps retreating into the woods. Moments later, the deputies were at her door, and Lena rushed to let them in, her legs trembling so badly she nearly stumbled. She explained what she had seen and heard, and they swept the property with flashlights searching for any sign of Garrett. They found footprints in the mud near the barn and evidence that the padlock on the door had been forced open, but Garrett himself was gone. One deputy radioed for a K-9 unit to assist in the search, but by the time the dog arrived and picked up the scent, it had already dissipated into the dense forest beyond the property line. "Ms. Harris, we need you to come take a look at this," the other deputy called softly from inside the barn. Lena followed him reluctantly, her breath catching when she saw what he was pointing at. Stacked against the far wall were several old wooden crates, their lids pried partially open. Inside, nestled among layers of rotting canvas, were rows of rusted metal canisters marked with faded hazard symbols. The air inside the barn was thick with a chemical odor, acrid and sharp enough to sting her eyes. "These are dangerous," the deputy said gravely, stepping back. "We don't know what's inside, but given the condition of the containers, it could be toxic." He instructed her to stay out of the structure until a hazmat team could arrive to secure the materials. Lena's mind reeled as she stepped back into the cold night air. She remembered the environmental specialist's warnings about contamination, and realized with a sickening certainty that Garrett must have known about the canisters all along. The crates were likely decades old, relics of whatever industrial activity had taken place on the land before she purchased it, and their presence would have been yet another reason for the county to condemn his property. Was that why he had broken into the barn? To retrieve or destroy the evidence? Or was he planning something far worse, something that might endanger not just her home, but the entire area? The deputies stayed on the property until nearly dawn, securing the broken section of fence with temporary barriers and positioning their cruisers at the end of the driveway as a deterrent. They urged Lena to pack a bag and stay elsewhere until the hazmat team could clear the barn, but she refused. "I'm not leaving my home," she said firmly, though her voice shook. "This is exactly what he wants, for me to feel like I don't belong here." The deputies exchanged a worried glance but did not press the issue. They promised to increase patrols in the area and advised her to call immediately if Garrett returned. The following day was a blur of official activity. The hazmat team arrived in full protective gear, carefully removing the canisters from the barn and loading them into reinforced containers for transport. They explained that the labels were too degraded to immediately identify the chemicals inside, but that some appeared to be volatile industrial solvents banned decades ago. Lena signed a series of documents confirming the removal of hazardous materials from her property, her hand cramping as she wrote her name over and over again. Each signature felt like a step deeper into a situation that was spiraling beyond her control. Garrett remained conspicuously absent throughout the process, but Lena knew better than to believe he had simply given up. That belief was confirmed the next night when she was awakened again by the shrill ping of a motion alert. She checked the camera feed and saw, to her horror, that Garrett was standing directly beneath the back porch light, his face twisted into a mask of fury. He held a gasoline canister in one hand and a matchbook in the other, and for a moment Lena thought he was going to set the entire house ablaze. She scrambled for the phone, dialing 911 as he tipped the canister over the temporary barrier and began dousing the splintered fence posts with fuel. She shouted through the closed window, begging him to stop, but he only looked up at her with a sneer before striking a match and tossing it into the puddle of gasoline. The flames leapt high and fast, engulfing the barrier and sending a column of black smoke into the sky. Lena backed away from the window, coughing as the acrid fumes reached her nostrils, and grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen. She sprayed the nearest flames desperately, managing to contain the fire near the porch until the sound of approaching sirens forced Garrett to retreat into the woods once again. The deputies arrived minutes later, their flashlights sweeping the trees as they called for him to surrender, but Garrett had vanished just as he had before. This time, however, they were not willing to leave Lena alone. They posted a cruiser at the foot of her driveway for the remainder of the night and began coordinating with the county to issue a warrant for Garrett's arrest. Lena sat at her kitchen table long after the deputies left, the acrid scent of smoke still clinging to her hair and clothes. She stared at the blackened remains of the temporary barrier through the window and felt a cold, hollow fear settle deep in her chest. Garrett had crossed a line that could not be ignored, and yet she knew that until he was in custody, she would not truly be safe. She considered leaving the property, staying with a friend or booking a room in town, but the thought of abandoning the home she had poured so much of herself into made her bristle. She would not let Garrett drive her away. The next morning, she called Tom and asked him to return with his crew to repair the fence permanently. They worked for 2 days straight, replacing the damaged sections with reinforced steel panels sunk deep into the ground. Lena stayed outside with them, not wanting to be alone in the house, and though Garrett did not appear, she could not shake the feeling that he was nearby, watching. The deputies stopped by periodically to check on her, updating her on their search efforts. "We're close," one of them assured her quietly. "We have enough evidence now. He can't run from this forever." But Lena had already learned that Garrett was not the kind of man who went quietly. She could feel the storm gathering, the sense that he would make one final, desperate attempt to reclaim control before the law closed in around him. She only hoped she would be ready when it came. The warrant for Garrett's arrest was officially issued 3 days after he set fire to the temporary barrier, and Lena could sense the tension in the deputies' voices each time they updated her. They believed he was still somewhere in the area, likely hiding out on his property or in the woods that bordered it, but he had managed to evade every attempt to locate him. Patrol cars made frequent passes down her road, their headlights briefly illuminating the trees before vanishing again. But Lena could not bring herself to feel reassured. She knew how easily Garrett could slip in and out of the dense forest that surrounded them. He had proven it repeatedly. The knowledge that he was likely watching, waiting, made it impossible for her to relax. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps, every rustle of leaves like the whisper of someone moving just out of sight. She barely slept, her phone always within reach, the security system armed and cameras checked obsessively for any sign of movement. On the 4th night after the warrant was issued, a storm rolled in, drenching the ground with sheets of rain and filling the air with the low rumble of distant thunder. Lena stood at the window in the kitchen, watching the downpour streak across the glass, when the power abruptly flickered and went out. She froze, gripping the counter, her breath catching as the house was plunged into silence. The storm had knocked out power before, but this felt different. She reached for her phone, only to see the signal bars vanish one by one until she was left with a dead connection. Somewhere outside there was a sharp metallic crack, followed by the distant clang of something heavy hitting the ground. Lena's stomach turned cold. The fence. She grabbed the flashlight she kept by the door and moved cautiously into the living room, pausing every few steps to listen. The rain pounded on the roof, masking all other sounds, and she hated the thought of how easily someone could approach without being heard. She had just reached the hallway when the motion alert on her phone vibrated sharply, startling her so badly she nearly dropped the light. She fumbled to pull up the camera feed, her hands slick with sweat, and saw exactly what she had feared. Garrett, standing at the edge of the porch with something heavy clutched in his hands. The camera's resolution was grainy in the storm, but Lena could make out the shape of a crowbar, and the sight made her chest tighten with panic. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. The deputies would never arrive in time if she called now, not with the roads washed out by the storm and no signal on her phone. She could barricade herself in one of the rooms, but the thought of being trapped while Garrett methodically tore his way through the house was unbearable. She thought briefly of running into the woods, but the image of Garrett catching her in the dark was worse. She forced herself to take a slow, steady breath and reached for the small canister of pepper spray she kept in the kitchen drawer, tucking it into the pocket of her jacket. The first blow against the back door came a moment later, the sound reverberating through the entire house. Lena flinched and ducked behind the heavy oak table in the dining room, holding the flashlight low to avoid drawing attention. Garrett struck the door again and again, the wood splintering with each impact until it finally gave way with a crack like breaking bones. Lena could hear him breathing now, ragged and wet with exertion as he stepped inside. She stayed perfectly still, listening as his boots squelched against the wet floorboards. He moved slowly, methodically, pausing to glance into each room as though savoring the fear he knew she was feeling. When he reached the hallway, Lena crept silently toward the kitchen, her pulse hammering so loudly she was sure he would hear it. She had almost reached the door when a floorboard creaked beneath her weight. Garrett's head snapped up, and in an instant he was moving toward the sound. Lena bolted for the kitchen, her shoes slipping on the wet wood, and barely managed to slam the door shut before he reached it. He hit the other side hard, the impact rattling the frame, and Lena jammed the chair beneath the handle as a makeshift barricade. Garrett cursed and struck the door again, the wood groaning, and Lena knew it was only a matter of time before it splintered. She looked around frantically for anything that might buy her more time and spotted the back window. It was narrow and partially obscured by the counter, but she might be able to squeeze through. She shoved it open and climbed onto the counter, heart pounding as Garrett's crowbar splintered the door behind her. Rain lashed her face as she wriggled through the gap and dropped into the mud outside, twisting her ankle painfully as she landed. She bit back a cry and pushed herself up, limping toward the barn, the only structure sturdy enough to hide in until help arrived. Garrett was close behind. She could hear him shouting her name, his voice distorted by the wind and rain. "You think you can take everything from me?" he bellowed, the words barely audible over the storm. "You think you can just call the cops and they'll save you? They won't. No one will." Lena reached the barn and ducked inside, shoving the heavy door shut behind her. She scanned the dark interior with her flashlight, desperate for a place to hide. Most of the crates had been removed by the hazmat team, leaving only a few rusting tools and a tangle of old ropes hanging from the rafters. She darted into the far corner and crouched low behind a stack of empty feed bins, forcing herself to slow her breathing. The barn door creaked open a moment later, and Garrett stepped inside. He moved slowly, dragging the crowbar along the floor in a deliberate rhythm. "I know you're in here," he said softly, almost conversationally. "You've been watching me, calling the county, telling them lies about my land. But you don't understand, Lena. This place is mine. It's all I have left, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else take it away." Lena gripped the canister of pepper spray so tightly her knuckles ached. She could see the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the barn, inching closer to her hiding spot. When the light hit the bins, she held her breath, willing herself to remain invisible. Garrett took another step forward, then another, until he was so close she could hear the wet squelch of his boots. She waited until he leaned forward to peer behind the bins, then burst upward and sprayed the pepper spray directly into his face. Garrett howled, dropping the crowbar as he clutched at his eyes, and Lena bolted past him, grabbing the tool as she went. She sprinted through the open barn door and into the rain, the crowbar heavy in her hands. Behind her, Garrett stumbled after her, still half blind, cursing and shouting. She made it to the house, limping on her injured ankle, and slammed the front door shut, throwing the bolt just as Garrett reached the porch. This time, she did not wait. She ran to the kitchen, grabbed the landline phone she had installed for emergencies, and dialed 911. The dispatcher's calm voice was a lifeline as Lena explained the situation, her words tumbling out in a rush. The dispatcher assured her that units were already on their way and told her to stay on the line until they arrived. Garrett pounded on the door, his voice raw with fury. "You can't hide forever," he screamed, but his words were drowned out by the sudden blare of sirens approaching through the storm. Lena clutched the phone and stared at the door, her entire body trembling as red and blue lights finally pierced the darkness outside. The deputies stormed up the porch with weapons drawn, their commands slicing through the roar of the rain. Garrett froze for the briefest moment, his fist still hammering at the front door, before instinct drove him to bolt into the yard. Lena, clutching the landline phone to her chest, could only watch through the rain-streaked window as beams of flashlights cut across the property, following the shadow of a man who refused to be caught. The storm turned the yard into a mire of mud and standing water, and Garrett's boots slipped as he ran, giving the deputies just enough of an advantage to close the distance. He swung wildly at them when they caught up, shouting incoherent curses, but there was no escaping the numbers or the training of the officers. A taser crackled and Garrett went down hard into the soaked earth, his body seizing before finally going still. Lena stood frozen at the door, unable to fully process that it was over until one of the deputies knocked and called her name, asking if she was safe. She opened the door slowly, still gripping the crowbar she had carried from the barn, her entire body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. They gently took the weapon from her hands and guided her to the porch, where she stood shivering in the rain as they cuffed Garrett and loaded him into the back of a cruiser. He glared at her as they pushed his head down to keep him from hitting the frame of the car, his eyes bloodshot and burning with a hatred that seemed undiminished even in defeat. Lena forced herself to meet his gaze, not out of defiance, but because she wanted the last image he saw to be of the woman who had refused to be driven from her home. The storm finally began to break as the cruisers pulled away, leaving Lena with 2 deputies who remained behind to secure the property. They walked her through the house, inspecting the splintered door frame and the trail of muddy footprints Garrett had left behind. One of them took her statement in the living room, while the other called for a forensic team to document the damage and collect evidence. Lena answered the questions as clearly as she could, though her voice still shook and her hands refused to stop trembling. She kept thinking about how close it had all come, how easily one mistake could have turned the night into something irreversible. It was nearly dawn by the time the deputies left, promising to keep her updated on Garrett's charges and court dates. Lena locked the new temporary door they had installed, set the security system once again, and collapsed onto the couch, too drained to even make it upstairs to her bed. She slept fitfully, waking at every distant noise. But for the first time in weeks there was no underlying dread that Garrett might be standing in the shadows outside her window. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. The county prosecutor reached out to assure her that Garrett would be facing multiple felony charges, including arson, breaking and entering, and possession of hazardous materials. His property was officially condemned, and the process to remove the remaining outbuildings and clear the land had already begun. Lena was asked if she intended to press additional charges for the damages to her home, and though the thought of another round of court proceedings exhausted her, she agreed. It was not about vengeance. It was about making sure there were no loose ends that might allow Garrett to come back and terrorize her again. 1 week after his arrest, a certified letter arrived from the county offering Lena the opportunity to purchase the portion of Garrett's property that bordered her own. She opened it slowly, reading the words twice before allowing herself to feel the weight of what it meant. For months, she had lived in fear that the land she had worked so hard to restore would be taken from her. And now she had the chance to secure it permanently, to ensure that no one could use it as a weapon against her again. She called her attorney that afternoon and instructed him to begin the purchase process, even though it would strain her finances. The thought of finally being able to stand at the edge of her property without wondering who was watching from the other side was worth every penny. As the weeks passed and the immediate crisis faded, Lena began to rebuild the sense of safety she had lost. Tom and his crew returned to install a new reinforced door, repair the sections of the fence that had been destroyed, and add more lighting around the perimeter. She replaced the shattered glass in the windows and cleared the debris left behind by Garrett's final rampage, each repair a small act of reclaiming her home. The scars were still there, the blackened ground where the barrier had burned, the gouges in the porch from the crowbar, but they no longer felt like reminders of fear. They were proof that she had survived. One crisp morning, Lena stood at the edge of the lake with a mug of coffee in her hands, the early sunlight turning the water to gold. The air was still and quiet except for the distant hum of machinery on Garrett's former property, where crews were dismantling the last of the rotted-out buildings. She thought about everything that had happened since the night she had first smelled smoke on the wind. How a single reckless act had spiraled into something far more dangerous and complicated than she could have imagined. She had been forced to defend herself in ways she never wanted to live with a level of vigilance that left her drained and wary, but she had not allowed Garrett's rage to dictate the terms of her life. She knew there would still be moments when the memory of his voice in the dark or the sight of his shadow on her porch